Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel, and my sincerest apologies, I haven't posted anything new for a couple of weeks. There's been an awful lot going on and I'm not going to bore you with the details of my personal life, but needless to say I've been a little bit busy, but I am going to get back on track and start dropping some more content now. In fact, I'm going to try and drop some content across all of this next week. I've got an awful lot to catch up on, and one area that I've been a bit neglectful of this year is the Star Wars Black Series. Now, I happen to love this line. I know an awful lot of people aren't that interested in it, and to be honest, these videos don't tend to get an awful lot of views, but nevertheless I want to share them with you because I really enjoy this line, and there's been a few great releases recently. So without further ado, I'm going to start off by taking a look at the recent Duel of the Fates box set, or the Phantom Menace box set, which is featuring a re-release of Qui-Gon Jinn, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and of course Darth Maul. So looking at the packaging, it's a little bit underwhelming, to be honest. I did expect a little bit more from a deluxe box set like this. It is essentially what we get with the single carded figures, but kind of elongated, just like kind of stretched out. So we have these black borders, which is a little bit bland. I'm not a huge fan of that. We have the window display here, and we have these three figures just kind of like plonked in there. I thought maybe they might have posed these to be a little bit more interesting, a bit more exciting, so that you could actually put the packaging on display, have these sort of maybe looking as if they're fighting each other or something. No, and sadly there's nothing really behind the figures either to really make this packaging really pop, make these really, draw the eye a little bit. Usually they have something like a colourful red background or something like that, but it's actually just grey, which is surprising. On the side panel, we do have these nice images here of Qui-Gon Jinn, of course Obi-Wan Kenobi and Darth Maul there. These are nice artist renditions. I like this. I really do like this approach that they take with the Black Series these days, and I think this looks good. It just feels very small, really, and not really something you're going to be practically able to display. And then finally on the reverse, we have those images writ a bit larger this time, which look pretty cool, and then we have some text there, and then some small print. So again, a little bit bland. I feel like they've missed an opportunity here, and it does feel a little bit phoned in, if I'm being completely honest. I'm slightly underwhelmed by this, which is disappointing. So let's start off by taking a look at Qui-Gon Jinn. Now, to the best of my knowledge, this is pretty much a straight re-release. I don't believe they've made any major tweaks or alterations to this figure other than giving him his cloak this time around. But if we take a look at this head sculpt, I have to say, I think they've nailed this. This is absolutely excellent. I think this is a really, really sharp likeness of Liam Neeson. I really like the paint apps that they've applied to this face in general, but particularly on the beard, where we can actually see some grey hairs there coming through. I think this looks really, really good. So I have to say, I really like this sculpt. I think it works an absolute treat. I also think the hood works particularly well. It fits perfectly around his head there, and it doesn't look too big or too sloppy or too tight either. It just looks quite right, which is fantastic. Now, the robes of the body are made up of hard and soft plastics and rubbers here and there. There's not an awful lot going on when it comes to paint apps, sadly. There's no washes which really draw out the detail here, and it desperately needs it because these Jedi tend to be a little bit muted in the colours that the colour scheme they adopt. So having that wash would have just given us a bit more detail and made this look a little bit more impressive. As it is, it can look a little bit bland, a bit beige, but the sculpting is very nice, and there's some nice details there on the belt. Returning to the cloak for a moment, I have to say I think they've done a really nice job of the tailoring on this figure. It fits in all the right places, yet feels like you have plenty of room there to be able to do some interesting stuff with it. So it will wrap all the way around, which is fantastic, without looking too big or too sloppy, and I think they've done a really nice job. Now, for me, I love it when they give them cloth accessories like capes and cloaks like this. It just adds an extra texture that I think really enhances the figure overall, so I'm really delighted with this. In terms of hands, he just comes with the two, so he doesn't get any additional hands in terms of accessories, and they're both gripping hands, and this is of course ideal because of course you're going to want him to be able to hold his lightsaber, and yes, he can hold it with both of these hands, which is really good. In terms of the legs, he does have individual unique bespoke boots, which I think is really cool. They've captured that detail here. Again, no paint wash, which is a real shame, a missed opportunity, but the sculpting is top notch. Moving on to articulation, technically there's a ball joint here at the top of the neck, but because of the two long hair pieces, there's very little movement you can get out of this. He does have ball joints in the shoulders, which are more successful. He can lift his arms up and out. There is a pin swivel at the elbow, which is a shame, but that does allow the arm to bend to roughly 45 degrees, give or take, and it will rotate all the way around. He does have the standard pin swivel, of course, at the wrist as well, so the hand will rotate all the way around, and it will sort of hinge forwards and backwards, but again, it's restricted by the sleeve. Now, I'm not sure if there's a ball joint or just a straight swivel at the waist. You can't get an awful lot of movement out of this. He will move side to side, but that's basically it. He can't bend forwards or backwards or anything like that. He's got the standard ball joint in the hips, the legs will kick out to the side. There is a thigh swivel at the very top there that will move the leg from side to side. Of course, the leg will kick forwards and backwards. Again, a little bit of hindrance there from the rubber of that hard rubber tunic, which is a shame. But he does have a double joint at the knee, and he can get his lower leg all the way back there. And then finally, we have the ankle rocker that will allow the foot to hinge forwards and backwards, but also, of course, rock from side to side. Sadly, he only comes with the one accessory, which is his lightsaber, and I have to say it is very nicely sculpted and very well painted, but it does feel like there's a missed opportunity here to maybe give him some extra bits and pieces, especially for those people who've maybe bought this figure already and need a reason to double dip. And of course, as we've come to expect with Black Series Jedi figures, of course his lightsaber does have a peg on it, and there is a peg hole on his belt, so of course you can slot that neatly in there. And I have to say this looks pretty cool. My only criticism is that the lightsaber does look perhaps a little bit too long. I'm not sure if that's quite to scale, but I could be wrong on that. And that about sums it up for Qui-Gon Jinn. So for me, actually, this is a 4-star figure. I think the likeness is really strong. I'm actually quite impressed with that. I think the cloak works really, really well. I'm really glad that we got that this time around, and I think it is worth it for that alone almost, because it really enhances this figure and just makes it look visually just a lot more interesting, which is great. I really like the lightsaber, and overall, I think this is a really nice, strong-looking figure in my collection. My only criticisms are what is holding it back in terms of that final star to give it a full 5 stars. Well, it's the articulation, really. I think, it's a little bit ham-fisted, it's a little bit clunky, it doesn't have quite the range I would hope for. Added to that, I think they've missed the boat when it comes to accessories as well. I think a couple of little extra bits and pieces, his communicator, for example, there's a number of different things that he has in the film that they could have used here and made this a selling point of this set, and they missed that opportunity. So, moving on to Darth Maul, and Darth Maul, funnily enough, was one of the very first figures in the Black Series all those years ago, and I can tell you firsthand that there is some retooling and some resculpting going on here. So if we start by talking about the likeness, I think we can hopefully all agree that this is a pretty good likeness. To be fair, I don't think I've ever seen a bad likeness of Darth Maul. He's just got one of those faces that translates very well to action figures, and pretty accurately for the most part. So I'm very happy with the way this looks. Now, if we compare this to the original release actually had 2 heads, which is kind of cool. And if we look at the horned head of that original release, this looks to be slightly different to me. I think it has a slightly different expression on the mouth, and the colours are a little bit different as well. I also think the head is ever so slightly smaller this time around. Now, I might be mistaken on that. Fortunately, I don't have it in hand to put them side by side, but it was something that really jumped out to me when I released this figure from the packaging. Just the head just seemed to be a little bit smaller than I was expecting, which is kind of interesting. Now, part of that might be because, of course, this time around he comes with the cloth cape, and once again, as you can see here, it comes with a hood that can wrap all the way around the head. Now, there's a lot more space here because the head's a bit smaller. There's a lot more give in that cloak. The material's a lot thinner as well than what we saw with Qui-Gon Jinn, and it actually creates more of a place to hide the head within, which actually works really well. I think that is perfectly appropriate for Darth Maul. I think it's accurate to what we see on screen, and it means that you can do a lot more with it. You can either have his face completely obscured, or you can show a little bit of it or all of it. It's entirely up to you. But again, I think this works really well, and I do think this is a step up over the original release for me personally. The only criticism I have of it is the thinness of the material. As you can see there, the light is actually shining through the material, particularly on the sleeves, which look a little bit clunky. I think also there is a slight sense of it being ever so slightly too baggy around the top of his sort of the chest area there as well, which is a bit unfortunate. But otherwise, I do think it's actually very nicely tailored, particularly where we have this sort of the ridged sort of corduroy effect for the main part of the tunic there. I think looks really good. So for me, I love this. I really like having the cloth texture, as I've commented on already. So this enhances the figure in my opinion. But for those who like the more standard sort of plastic approach, you're probably best sticking with that first release. Underneath the cloth cloak, of course, is his standard sort of plastic tunic that you can see there. This is all sculpted in, all moulded in, so unfortunately there's not a lot of give. There are some soft plastic pieces in terms of the skirt, which will allow the legs to move, as we'll see a little bit later, but there's no paint apps here once again. In terms of the hands, well, again, he just comes with the one set of hands, and of course they are gripping hands to grip his lightsaber, and his boots, again, completely uniquely sculpted. They look pretty cool, just no paint washes running over them, which is unfortunate. The good news, though, is that he does fare a lot better in the articulation department than Qui-Gon. That ball joint in the neck really works this time around. He can spin his head all the way around, he can lean it left and right, and he can nod it up and down a pretty healthy distance too. Of course, he's got the same ball joint in the shoulders, so the arms will lift up and out. He does have the same sort of pin swivel at the elbow there, so he can rotate his lower forearm and of course hinge it to about 90 degrees. And he does have the pin swivel at the wrist as well. And again, he's able to get a lot more out of that wrist because he doesn't have the big sleeve sort of hindering that mobility, which is nice to see. Now in the waist he does have the ball joint there, so he can spin from side to side, and he's got a little bit of give as well when it comes to leaning left and right, which will also allow him to bend forwards and backwards a little bit as well. He's got the ball joints in the hips, of course, the legs kick out to the side, there is the thigh swivel at the top of the leg there as well. The legs will kick forwards and they will go backwards a little bit. Thankfully the plastic of this tunic is a bit more forgiving, it will allow a bit more mobility, which is great. He does have a pin swivel at the knee this time, so that means that lower leg will rotate all the way around, as well as hinge, of course, to about 90 degrees. And then we have that ankle rocker there as well, so once again hinging forwards and backwards and pivoting from side to side. Once again, the only accessory this time around is his lightsaber. It's very nicely sculpted, well painted, and of course it does come apart in the middle as well. So this is a really nice piece, again recycled from the first release, but that first release had a number of other interesting accessories that sadly have not been included here, including his binoculars and other bits and pieces. So this is a shame. And just as we saw with Qui-Gon, of course, he does have that peg hole on the belt and of course the peg on the lightsaber. Now, the hole is much smaller for Darth Maul and it's a bit more tricky to get into place, I've got to be honest. This feels a little bit tenuous, like it might just pop out from time to time, and it takes a little bit of perseverance to get it in there. Also, in terms of having this lightsaber sort of hooked onto his belt, it doesn't really work particularly well because it just looks a little bit clunky, and it doesn't really sit comfortably on his belt. It's just too big, to be honest, for him to carry around. But yeah, you get the idea. But despite all of that, I have to say he does look pretty damn cool when he's holding his lightsaber with both blades extended. For me, another 4 stars. I think this is a really nice figure. I do really like the addition of the cloth cape. I think this does work for me personally. I think people will be split on this though. All in all, I think it works perfectly well. I think the articulation is really good. I think the major criticism for me is, again, lack of accessories and the lack of paint apps. But otherwise, a really solid figure. And if you didn't get him first time around, this is a fantastic chance to pick this guy up because he's quite hard to find these days, that original release, and you know, it's a really nice figure, and of course he's such a major character, such a fan favourite, that you're going to want this guy in your collection. Which brings us finally to Obi-Wan Kenobi, and just like Qui-Gon, this is a straight re-release of an existing figure. The only difference this time around is that he does have his cloak, and for me that does make it, I've got to say. So in terms of the likeness, yeah, I think this is a pretty decent likeness. I don't think this is as sharp as Qui-Gon. I think this has a more than passing resemblance of Ewan McGregor in that film. I think it looks pretty good. I think it's obviously recognisable that it's him, but it's a little bit soft in places, there's no denying that. But overall the paint apps are pretty good, but there's nothing really particular to write home about here. I think the hood works less well with Obi-Wan than it did with Qui-Gon. It just looks a little bit too big and too clunky. There's often a little bit of a gap when you pull it up, and it just doesn't look quite right for me. Maybe I need to persevere with it a bit more. I still really like having the added texture of the cloak, and I think the cloak in itself is pretty cool. I just think it's not as successful here as it was with Qui-Gon, and maybe it's because they've used the same kind of cloak for both figures and they're different sizes and shapes, and maybe it works better with Qui-Gon than it does with Obi-Wan for that reason. But it does look a little bit too big on Obi-Wan, I have to say. Much like with Qui-Gon, there's very little in the way of paint apps. There's no shading or washes on this, and these Jedi robes really need that. Even more so, I think, with Obi-Wan, because he doesn't really have any difference in tones between his robes. They're all pretty much crisp white, so he looks even more bland, I suppose, and he really just needs a little bit of shading here and there to draw it out, and sadly that isn't present. Once again, the same is true of the hands as we saw with the previous two figures, just the one set of hands, both gripping hands for his lightsaber, and his boots, of course, unique and distinct, and they look really, really good, but same criticism, sadly, no paint washes over this to just really draw out the detail, which is, a shame. Articulation wise, he has the same ball joint in the top of the neck. Again, this is much more successful than on the Qui-Gon figure. He can move his head all the way around, lean it left and right a little bit, and he can nod it up and down a little bit as well, but not quite as good as Darth Maul. He's got the same ball joints in the shoulders, of course they lift up and out, the same pin swivel as we saw with Qui-Gon there as well for the lower forearm, spinning that all the way around and hinging to about 90 degrees, and then we have the pin swivel of course at the wrist as well. Again, a little bit more successful than Qui-Gon here because the sleeves aren't quite as large. Now his ball joint in his waist, much more successful on Obi-Wan, I'm really pleased to say. He can actually get plenty of range of motion out of this waist joint, which is actually probably the best of the three in all truth. He's got the ball joint in the hips of course, and he's got the thigh swivel there, so no surprises there. The legs will kick forwards and click backwards. Again, a bit more give than we saw with Qui-Gon, but it's still a little bit limited here unfortunately. Double joint at the knee, so that lower leg can kick all the way back, and then we have the ankle rocker again, so that foot will hinge forwards and backwards and rock from side to side. And yep, you guessed it, just the lightsaber as the accessory. And I have to say once again, very nicely sculpted, very nicely painted, a lot of detail on this, which is very successful. And of course, it's got the standard peg and the peg hole on the belt there, which works perfectly well with Obi-Wan. Again, is it slightly too long? I'm not sure, but it's minor details. All in all, this is pretty effective, and it looks pretty cool, I have to say. I do like how this looks on this figure. And so that leaves me once again with another 4 stars for this figure. I think all of these figures are actually really quite successful, and Obi-Wan is no exception. I think some of Obi-Wan's strengths are perhaps the weaknesses of Qui-Gon, and Qui-Gon's strengths are the weaknesses of Obi-Wan perhaps, but they all it kind of works out the same for all of them in the end. This is a great looking figure. I think it is enhanced by that cloak. Granted, it might be a little bit too large, but otherwise I think this looks really good. I'm really pleased with the articulation on Obi-Wan in particular. I think that works really well, and he's a really good looking figure in this collection, so I'm really happy. I think they've done a fantastic job, and for me personally, I didn't own this figure previously, so I'm glad to finally have a young Obi-Wan in my collection. So all in all, a pretty successful set. I think this is a really fun set. I think it's a fantastic second chance for anyone who missed these figures first time around. Whether you have bought these figures previously, whether you want to invest in a double dip, well, that is more debatable. For me personally, this worked out really well. I didn't have the Obi-Wan or the Qui-Gon, so this is a great success for me. I'm really pleased to have both these figures with their cloaks. Fantastic. The Darth Maul I did already own, but this looks significantly different enough for me to justify having a second Darth Maul in this collection, because I do really like that cloth cape. So you're going to have to make that decision for yourself, of course. Where I think Hasbro missed a trick here is that this set does feel a little bit phoned in. It does feel like they've just kind of re-released figures they already had, thrown some cloth capes on them, and hope that that's enough to excite people into buying this set. I think it's a shame. I think they could have made a lot more of this set. I think they could have made a lot more of the packaging to make it more of a display piece. And I think, as well as the cloaks, they could have given some additional accessories that perhaps didn't come with those figures first time around. As it is, they do feel a little bit bare bones, and the whole effort feels a little bit phoned in, as I mentioned earlier. But as I said, for collectors, if you missed these figures first time around, then this has got to be a must-buy, if you like Episode 1, of course. But if you already own these figures, then it's going to be hard to justify buying this set. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please do consider giving the video a like. That kind of thing really does help the channel out, and it allows me to keep making more content. And if you're interested in seeing more content, remember to hit subscribe, as there'll be plenty more videos coming soon.